All right. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. Before we begin, as a reflection of University of Sydney's recognition of the deep history and culture of the land on which it was built, I would like to acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. They stand on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I extend this acknowledgement to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people online here with us today. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. My name is Gorana Grgic, and I'm a senior lecturer at the United States Study Center, as well as the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. And if you have been paying attention for the past year, you would know that this event is one in the series of talks we have with NATO Expert as part of a joint initiative by the United States Study Center and NATO's Public Diplomacy Division. In this series, we try to explore the challenges ahead of NATO and Australia and propose areas where furthering and deepening cooperation can offer some solutions. Today on the agenda are the emerging and disruptive technologies, EDTs, and which are in fact a key facet of the NATO 2030 initiative, as well as an integral part of the discussions leading to the NATO's new strategic concept, which will be unveiled next year at the Madrid summit. So before we get underway, just a few housekeeping notes. We do encourage you to become part of these discussions and please do ask your questions as we go along. This can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A box you'll see on the bottom of your screens. You can then ask and vote for questions, and we will make sure that we go through all of them towards the latter half of our hour today. Apart from being streamed live on YouTube and Facebook, this discussion is also being recorded for later access on the US Study Center's media channels. But now back to the topic. Technological advancements that are being exploited for military and security purposes present both new opportunities for militaries around the world, as well as new threats that can emanate from both state and non-state actors. NATO has recently taken some decisive steps to retain its technological edge. It officially unveiled two new efforts meant to help the alliance invest in critical next-gen technologies and avoid capability gaps among the allies. We will hear more about these initiatives, as well as NATO's approach to emerging and disruptive technologies over the coming hour. To discuss both the risks and opportunities for NATO and allies, the ongoing work with public and private sector partners, academia, and civil society in this domain, as well as the areas where partner states such as Australia can cooperate on matters of EDT, I am very happy to introduce the Secretary General's primary advisor on emerging security challenges and their implications for the security of the alliance. Mr. David van Wiel is NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges and a member of the Secretary General's senior management team. Prior to joining NATO, David was the foreign policy and defense advisor for the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And prior to this, he had a long career in the Ministry of Defense of the Netherlands, where he held roles as the Director for International Affairs and Operations, after serving as the Chief of Cabinet for the Minister of Defense and the Permanent Secretary, as well as being the Senior Policy Officer for Operations in Afghanistan and Libya, and on issues such as nuclear policy and disarmament, special operations, and the defense budget. So we are in very capable hands here. The run sheet for today is as follows. We will have a couple of minutes first for Mr. Van Wiel's remarks, and then we'll get into a conversation mode. And as I said, I'll be looking closely into the Q&A box to make sure that all of your questions get a response, and that we keep this as lively and as interactive as possible. So the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gergich. Good evening to who's in Sydney from a cold and early Brussels. I'm really delighted to be the fourth speaker in this series, and especially to see so much interest from our partners in Australia. I understand that this series has included a focus on critical topics to NATO, including on resilience and disinformation, the NATO arms control agenda, and the outcomes of the Brussels summit. So that background gives me the opportunity to jump straight into NATO's approach to emerging and disruptive technologies, or as you said, EDTs, as well as innovation. As was previously touched upon when discussing the Brussels summit, allies agreed two exciting transatlantic defense innovation initiatives this past June. The first one is on a Defence Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or in acronym DIANA, an accelerator network that will foster transatlantic cooperation and exchanges on critical technologies by connecting the private sector and academia with the military. And in tandem, we're also establishing a NATO Innovation Fund. And this is a multinationally funded effort to provide venture financing to startups developing cutting edge technologies with a dual use. With private sector leading the way in innovation, NATO must adapt. We must meaningfully engage with all actors to ensure that the development and adoption of EDTs is underpinned by our democratic values. And in all of this, we see collaboration with partners like Australia, which has an excellent innovation ecosystem of its own, to be beneficial. I believe that there are important overlaps in how we approach technology and innovation. We can also learn from Australia in many of these areas, including building trust in autonomous systems and other emerging work strands that move away from traditional areas of capability development. Our shared values are the basis for these exchanges, and how these inform our engineering practices and adoption pathways are equally important. So by now you've heard me mention dual use innovation a couple of times, and let me expand on why exactly we're interested in these civil military links. We recognize that our most innovative technologies are no longer developed by the public sector, but instead by our civilian private sector and academia, financed by the private sector for commercial purposes. If dual use companies that operate primarily in the commercial space can pull us towards their pace of innovation, then we can also pull their efficiency and iterative advancements into our systems. From a policy perspective, we also recognize that these emerging and disruptive technologies require a novel approach. If we treat these new technologies the same way that we've approached capability development and risk mitigation in the past, then we risk missing out on enormous opportunities to shape our strategic environment. And I would refer to those of you tuning in tonight to read the public summary of the Artificial Intelligence Strategy, which is available at the NATO website. We see it as essential to issue our public-facing approach to this foundational technology. And let me explain that approach here. At NATO, allies agreed the coherent implementation strategy on emerging and disruptive technologies last February. This overarching document establishes how the alliance can best foster and protect allied developments in key technology areas, including artificial intelligence, data, autonomy, quantum technologies, and biotechnologies and human enhancement. Earlier this year, allies agreed the first ever strategy on AI, founded in robust principles of responsible use, thereby positioning NATO as a thought leader in ethical use of AI in defense. And we recognize that this is a status we have to earn, which is why we will be focusing on operationalizing our principles in the months ahead. At the same time, allies have also agreed to the Data Exploitation Framework Policy, with concrete measures to treat data as a shared strategic resource. And I mention this because our approaches to data and AI are naturally interdependent. And what this means for us, and this is true of how we look at all EDTs, is that we put a prime on coherence. The interdependencies between technologies, not just data and AI, but also others like autonomy, quantum, biotechnology, means that innovation is increasingly characterized by technological convergence. And it's important for us to remember as an alliance, because it's precisely this convergence that shapes the trajectory of innovation in front of us. On their own, technologies like AI, autonomy, or quantum science pose new challenges and significant opportunities for the ways we defend ourselves. But when combined, the transformative power of these technologies is even higher. For example, among other outputs, machine learning can be used to detect anomalous patterns in code to strengthen our cyber defense. AI-supported synthetic biology can lead to new cutting-edge camouflage solutions to make it harder for adversaries to detect our forces. And quantum information science can enable green solutions to our increasingly digital futures, for example, by unlocking new chemical combinations for green energy generation and storage. Safeguarding NATO's technological edge depends on how we understand and how we act on the disruptive effects that they breed. So be it in our approach to deep tech through our innovation initiatives or our policy approaches to these basket technologies, we recognize that we're in a rapidly evolving environment. And to navigate this environment, cooperation is absolutely critical. NATO is a natural forum for this cooperation. And with the shape and scale of technological change ahead of us, partnerships with countries like Australia offer excellent opportunities to develop and shape norms, to embed our shared values in technological development, to exchange best practices on trust and cooperation with commercially driven innovation sectors, and much more. But let me stop there, Dr. Gergic, and I look forward to continuing our conversation and answering some of your questions, hopefully.
That's excellent, and thank you so much. And thank you also to the audience, as I can see the Q&A box is starting to nicely fill up also with some questions that I have here pre-prepared already. I want to start off, as I normally do, with my academic hat on and kind of start us maybe from a more macro perspective here. And that is this whole idea of the impact of modern technology on security. Obviously, this is a central concern for military science. And from a perspective of someone who is both a student and a teacher of US foreign policy, I recall, obviously, the kind of literature of the late 90s and 2000s was filled with statements like the technological race of the current era is just beginning, maintaining an advantage requires constant improvements, etc., etc. And so this was very much the kind of era of revolution in military affairs. But now it again comes up this idea that we are living through a technological revolution. And as a result, obviously, one in the conduct of military affairs. We accept that as true. But in your mind, if we were to compare to just, you know, what happened 20 years ago when this was kind of the discourse that was very much in vogue, what would you say, how is this time different? Is it the blurring of the public and private sphere and what you mentioned around kind of dual uses? Is it the nature of rivals and competitors who are also able to use this? Is it the rise of just kind of non-state actors? What are your thoughts in terms of the kind of technological advancements in the context of the world in the third decade of the 21st century?
Thanks for the question. I think it's all of the above. That's my short answer. So it's a combination, but at the heart of the situation that we're in now is the steadily decline over the past 4 decades in investment in research and development by the public sectors in our nations in new technologies. So slowly we've begun to recede from the area of research and development. We've left this to the private sector, to academia, thereby creating a world where new technologies only arise when they have a commercial use, thereby creating a world where the military is not up to speed on what new technologies are arising, as opposed to the 80s when inventions like GPS started in the military and then became commercially viable. It's completely the other way around now. And we have to reconnect to these innovation ecosystems in order to see what technologies are around the corner, what potential security implications they might have, both in opportunities and in threats, thereby making sure that we create a new kind of dual use, which means that we're early adapters in the military, but still with technologies that will no longer be solely built for the military, because that's not the way that innovation works nowadays. And that brings a challenge with it, is in how do you regulate all these new technologies? How do you make sure that our values are embedded in those technologies? Uh, uh, the risks of under-regulation we're all seeing now with big tech. I think we're slowly waking up to the fact that we've let the unregulated space in which they operate for too long, and this is having impacts on our democracies, on our mental well-being of our citizens, on our security. So the aim at NATO now is to make sure that we catch up with technology, that we become a trusted partner in the ecosystems where these technologies are being developed, so that we're early in adopting them, we're early in deciding how to protect them from our adversaries, and that we're early in making sure that we also set the rules and the standards for these new technologies.
That's excellent. And one of the things that you mentioned here in terms of the location of innovation brings me to another question, and that relates to, well, the fact that we are able to communicate today is owing to the invention of internet, which was obviously something that very much came as a result of the investments that were made through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, another 5-letter acronym that starts with a D. So Diana has been, or the Defense Innovator Accelerator has been said to be modeled on DARPA. And, you know, in the United States these days, maybe there isn't a lot of bipartisanship a lot of the days, but it seems to me that at least in the Congress, there is a view that DARPA is a model for innovation, both inside and outside of the federal government. So could you tell us a bit more on the kind of origins of Diana and the kind of road to agreeing that this is something that NATO should be pursuing, and the fact that it was signed by, I note, 17 of the member states. So I've heard, or I've seen some of your comments around there being variety of reasons why the other 13 were left kind of missing in action on this one. But yeah, so getting to Diana and where we might see it go.
Thank you. And I have to say that I like the acronym Diana better than DARPA. But on the other hand, the reputation of DARPA and what it's achieved, of course, is something that Diana can only look up to and hopefully get near to in the future. So yes, there is inspiration of DARPA in the design of Diana, but also from other US institutions like FWorks or DIUX, and also from initiatives in other nations and allied countries, like the UK DASA or the French Defence Innovation Agency. So there's a lot of initiatives out there, and I think that the common denominator is the realization that you need to have a connection to these innovation ecosystem that are actually physically co-located in spaces. This doesn't happen online. It happens in communities, in universities, in buildings where people meet each other, where there's a vibe of innovation. And we need to reconnect to that. I think that that's what all these programs have in common. What they also have in common is that this needs flexibility, agility, least bureaucracy possible, and it needs to be taking risks. Not all these initiatives will succeed. And this, of course, is something to bring into an environment like NATO, which is probably one of the largest bureaucracies in the world, is kind of a challenge. So Diana has its own model, because it's constructed by 30 allies. So you mentioned the 17, that was for the Innovation Fund, but Diana will be at 30. And Diana will consist of a hybrid model. So Diana will have headquarters on both sides of the Atlantic, where challenge managers will be in charge of working on the problem sets that the 30 allies give to Diana on a biannual basis. And then Diana will make use of existing structures in the nations. So existing accelerator sites, and existing test centers scattered across the alliance. Now, why would NATO do that? That's because we have a huge economy of scale if we work at 30. So we have the potential of the best test centers scattered across Europe. That also means that if you're a startup working in Rome and you have a test center that is in Rome, then that's easy because startups are not flying all over the world to develop their products. So one, it's in your vicinity. Two, it makes sure that we can tap into all these 30 innovation ecosystems, thereby getting the best from 30 nations into the solution of a possible problem instead of one. And of course, for smaller nations, this is a big opportunity. It creates a bigger market because you have a potential of 30 militaries for your product, thereby also helping interoperability because we're not designing anti-drone systems in all 30 nations. But Diana, for example, will be doing this, creating one standard, one solution, and we're harnessing the scientific power of 30 allies. So the NATO Science and Technology Organization has 5,500 of the best academics in our allied countries united that can help us in evaluating proposals, in helping mature technology, in interacting with end users, in creating new technologies. So in short, I think that Diana is not replacing anything that exists, but it's harnessing the potential at 30 and thereby creating a large network that will hopefully allow us to tap into all the potential that we have. The Innovation Fund is separate but connected. That is multinationally funded. 17 nations signed up to it. I have to say by now we're up to 20 already. So we have 2/3 of the allies on board, and I expect more to follow because those 20 have now begun to set up the limited partner agreement of the Venture Capital Fund. But when they've done that, and that will be before the summer, others will get the chance to sign up to the partner agreement as it then stands. And the connection between the two is that if you have promising startups going through the Diana Accelerator program that get to a maturity where they actually have to scale up in order to become viable, that is the moment where there's a gap in the dual use world for security and defense, where private capital is risk averse at this time, hesitating to step in. It's called the Death Valley. And how do you keep those companies alive into the next phase of their existence? That is where the NATO Innovation Fund comes in. And it would not be the sole investor, but by proving that NATO has trust in a certain company to succeed in this sector, hopefully that will in turn crowd in venture capital that is now hesitant to step in.
Thank you so much for teasing out the differences then between Diana and the investment fund. And maybe just to quickly follow up then on the monetary aspect and kind of the sums attached to each. So am I right to understand the investment fund at the moment is around 1 billion or so in terms of commitments? And how do you then expect that Diana will be funded? There was some talk I noted around particular kind of percentages of contributions that will be made by allied states, but what is the kind of estimate for Diana's budget?
So Diana will actually be very mean and lean. As I mentioned, it will have offices on two sides of the ocean, and it will have challenge managers, and there's a bit of bureaucracy coming there because somebody has to turn on the light and pick up the phone, but they will be small offices. So it's very unlike the headquarters that I'm in now with 5,000 people crowding in every day and in a very impressive building. This will be very approachable. It will be co-located in one of these innovation hubs, interacting actually with the ecosystem that it needs to interact with. And then the accelerator sites and the test centers are existing already in these nations. So all the accelerator sites will do is run a separate NATO Accelerator program for the specific purpose of Diana, because they already have the connection to the ecosystem. They know the communities, and the community knows them. So that's an added benefit. And the test centers are existing, and I can name you one, but we've been offered 30 test centers, and one of them is the Niels Bohr Quantum Institute in Copenhagen. So we really have the world-class test centers that the NATO innovators can use through the Diana program, but we don't have to build them. Thank God, because we have to build quantum labs, then the price tag would certainly go up. But it's mainly leveraging what's already there. So we'll give it at a discount to the allies.
That's good. A discount, but not discounted quality necessarily. So this is what in international relations kind of scholarship we call solving some of these issues of coordination and collaboration. It strikes me that a lot of that is being done in having that kind of central hub, but still leveraging those assets that are present in the member states. I can see we already have tons of questions, and some of them actually speak directly to a couple of more that I have pre-prepared. So thank you, Christopher Skinner, also for raising this one. And this is moving us a bit more into the substance of some of the innovation that's taking place, namely the kind of perennial issue of ethics. And in specific, there was some mention here in the question around the integration of autonomy into weapon systems, but I would put it more broadly as ethical issues in general. I do know that allies have recently agreed on NATO's first ever artificial intelligence strategy. So there's certainly some talk of setting standards and rules of the road. But you know yourself best that over the past certainly decade or so, we've had a lot of headlines that would go like, you know, the U.S. Army wants to build, you know, AI-powered killing machines, or scientists have come together to protest a program that would create these insect allies that would, you know, leverage kind of biological weapons in a way that could have far-reaching implications for the crops and agriculture in general. And obviously, this raises a lot of, first of all, publicity, but then makes some of these institutions have to walk back and kind of do a lot of explaining as to what these programs are and how they actually follow standards and manuals on using these innovations or particular types of systems. So to kind of hopefully you've had a chance to take a sip of water there, but maybe then the issue of ethics, whether it's related to autonomous weapons or more broadly.
Well, I always get the killer robot question within the first minute of any appearance, and
I'm glad
as you
that
state,
then I broke that tradition then.
as you state, I like to look at it more broadly. So as new technologies emerge, as they always have, there will always be a dual use, whether we like it or not. But whether it was a steam engine or electricity being invented, it is inconceivable that it would not be used or misused for defense or security purposes. So if you take that as a fact of life, that you cannot shield technology from a certain sector, then the question is, how do you want to approach the defense use of these new technologies? Now, as I said, 40 years ago, that was not a question because most of the new technology started in the defense sector. GPS, the internet, the mRNA vaccines that we're now getting, they all came from the defense sector. So the defense sector was seen as driving technology. Now it's the other way around, and that leads to all these questions, whether or not you can shield defense or the defense sector from these technologies. And my plea is not to do it. My plea is to as we've always done, embrace new technologies, understand them, look at the potential security implications of those technologies, because the fact that we wouldn't use it doesn't mean that our adversaries would not use those technologies. So we need an in-depth knowledge. And then the question is more, what do you do with these technologies? How do you approach them from an ethical point of view? And that's where we need to bring our own values and norms into the use of this technology. And the AI strategy that you mentioned is our first proof of how we intend to do that. But the data exploitation framework policy that I mentioned, which is not public, but has the same principles of responsible use. So yes, as with all weapon systems, as with all technology that we use in our Western armed forces, ethics come along with the use of that technology. Now, the difficulty with something like AI is that the ethics don't always come at the end. The ethics have to start with the development, because it's a bit of software that we're engraining. And that's why I said operationalizing of these principles is important, because we have to assure that from the moment the software coding process begins, that the principles that we adhere to are actually being ingrained into the AI that's being used. And we need to be able to verify that in test centers. And we need to have protocols to do that. And we need the private sector to understand that if you want to do business with NATO or NATO nations for defense and security purposes, then that's exactly what you need to adhere to. And it includes things like lawfulness, like accountability, bias mitigation. So all the things that as societies we deem important, we have now adopted as 30 allies as being essential in order for us to use AI. And then to say that AI could not be used for defense purposes is ridiculous, because an F-35 at the moment uses a lot of AI processes in order to process information. Your iPhone uses AI in order to make sure that if you press the button and make a picture, that you actually get something that looks rather professional without you having studied on how to adjust your camera lenses. So AI is everywhere. It's a pervasive technology. Now the specific combination of autonomy and AI and the use of lethal force against human beings, because that is the very specific, very narrow focus case that we're looking at. Of course, at this moment, I think we all agree that having autonomous weapon systems killing humans autonomously without any human interaction is not something that fits into our ethical principles. So that's where we stand now. But I would say, as we're looking at the self-driving cars in San Francisco and the enormous increase of the capabilities of self-driving cars and the software, I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years you would get a fine if you drive yourself in San Francisco instead of put your car on self-drive because you're behaving recklessly. Because a self-driving car will prevent much more accidents and collateral damage than you as a human can. We're not there now, but I'm pretty sure we'll get there. And at that point, we will have to start a discussion again, whether or not the use of AI to assist us in preventing collateral damage, which might proven result in a reduce of that, would not be something that we would want to embrace. As said, that's something provocative for the future, but the ethics go much broader than this one use case.
Yeah, and it's interesting certainly to observe the way in which just the technological advancements have been kind of racing with the kind of the ethics and the moral sort of principles and the role for philosophers actually to play moving forward. But yeah, certainly these days we are still more scared, I guess, of people who are playing video games and driving in self-driving cars. At least there was a headline in one of the papers a couple of days ago. There is a follow-up. Again, I thank Christopher Skinner for posing this one around the ethical use of AI being only effective if our antagonists follow the same rules. How does NATO address this?
Yeah, I don't think we'll get a global treaty on the responsible use of AI for security and defense. One, because I think that our values differ too much in order to be able to come to this consolidated view. Second, because unlike with nuclear weapons, where you can actually verify, you can have export controls, you have physical structures that you can monitor. AI is very hard to verify whether or not your opponents are adhering to the principles that we all agreed on. So getting a better view on what's happening also in the nations of our adversaries and competitors with regards to the development of AI use for defense is a very large part of our strategy. We need to know what can be used against us in case of conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to copy that behavior. The question is just how do you defend against the unethical use of, for example, AI in the battlefield. And that's part of the discussion that where NATO feels we have a role to play to feed into the general debate on how do you regulate AI, to feed this security and defense aspect from a threat perspective, but also from a use perspective, to feed that into the general debate. So, for example, in the European Union, there is now legislation in being on the use of AI, the restrictions on AI, the definitions of AI, and then there's an exclusion clause for AI that is specifically designed for national security or defense purposes. I would rather have a more inclusive legislation, but then based on the input from a security and defense perspective. So having more holistic legislature, because the dual use nature of these technologies makes it very difficult to define what is specific for a security use and what is more for commercial use. It all interflows, but let's be realistic about what we also need to defend ourselves. And let me name drone swarming as an example. The technology is not there yet on a large scale, but it's really around the corner. And at the moment, we're defending against drones with other drones that cast net over the drones that you want to stop and then drop them somewhere in a canal or somewhere where it can't do any damage. Now, that's sort of working on a one-to-one basis, but how are we going to do this with a drone swarm of 300 explosive drones coming towards us in conjunction? We need AI, we need autonomy, we need that technology in order to design systems that can help us there. So to have that awareness of what we might need ourselves to defend is a critical part of the whole debate on how to approach ethics. Crucial to this, if I can, Doctor, is one thing, and I sat on a panel where a professor of a renowned Western university said in 2 consecutive sentences, the social credit system that China uses is positive and necessary because they had a big problem with jaywalking in Beijing. And the next sentence was, I'm really afraid that NATO or allied countries will use AI for defense purposes. Now, that means we have a problem. We have a problem in perception of trust in our own defenses that come from our own democratic values and norms. And this is being spread into our universities. So there's an averse atmosphere as to working with our own defense ministries and industry, whilst at the same time we see that we are producing technology for regimes that completely don't adhere to our democratic norms and values. So that's something that we need to work on.
So hopefully fora like this one and more conversations and pointing out maybe to some of these logical fallacies would be a step in the right direction, I think. And I would certainly subscribe to the notion that there is at least to start with some cognitive dissonance there with that example that you have given. But also we are slowly getting to the last part of our conversation here, given that we have just about 15 or so minutes left. We did mention killer drones and so killer robots and drone swarms. So I think we've ticked the boxes in terms of things that, you know, are usually, you know, those that make people kind of stay up late at night and worry about the technological progress when transplanted into military affairs. But let me shift gears somewhat and maybe preface this by saying, you know, is there some sort of defense for the mundane and the kind of role that legacy systems and low tech might play in the future of warfare? I know there was one question here that basically asked whether, you know, quantum computing or hypersonic weapons are just basically enhancements on existing concepts. But I would just say, you know, more broadly again, just until a couple of years ago, NATO was way more interested in and worried about asymmetric warfare, right? And the potential for, but especially non-state actors to wreak havoc using things that aren't necessarily super advanced. So maybe, you know, there are a couple of aspects to this question, but what do you see, what's the role for legacy systems, for low-tech technologies in the future of warfare? Will they complement or will they hinder present innovation initiatives? How might we deal with that sort of path dependence, if you wish, moving forward, especially in bureaucratic and hierarchical organizations, as you said you yourself are sitting in?
Oh yes, and I'm certainly seen as a disruptor here internally, which is exactly what I was hired to do. So I'm I'm proud to be. I think it's a combination. It's revolution and evolution. But I think that up till now we've been too much in an evolution mindset, and we need to have a bit more of the revolution mindset, especially as we see that our potential adversaries and competitors are working on the revolution scale as well as the evolution scale. So no, legacy systems won't go away. At the same time, we have to challenge ourselves continuously whether or not the problem we're trying to solve can be solved in a different way than by replacing the current legacy system that we have with something that looks like it, but is a little bit bigger, faster, and can shoot a little bit further. And that's the kind of challenge where Diana is going to help us. It will be a kind of a disruptive element in the ecosystem of NATO, where you can bring problems there and see what kind of possible solutions are there without predefining the outcome. And now I would say that most of our defense systems work on the basis of military requirements that quite specifically state what kind of new system is needed with what capabilities. That is denying the potential that there might be a technology out there that can solve the problem you're trying to solve, but in a completely different way. So just off the top of my mind, we're now looking at Russia having ballistic missiles to shoot down satellites. And we've seen an example of that a few weeks ago when they performed a test. Now, that's a big problem if you're relying on single satellites for example, espionage or communication. But now let's look at Spacex and their Starlink system. So there's already 2,500 satellites up there. They will go up to, I think, about 4,500. It's a mesh network, so you can shoot down 100 if you want, but you will not degrade the network. It provides a worldwide broadband coverage, and all the satellites come back to Earth within 2 years because they realize that their technology will be obsolete within that time frame. So they need to replace it. It's a completely different way of looking at the problem you're trying to solve, which is how can we have reliable worldwide communication? So to have more of that disruptive mindset into the defense planning process might help us. And do new technologies provide a complete disruption or not? Some will, some won't. You could state that hypersonics is uh, a gradual evolution because it's just a faster missile. So you need better missile defense. So that's a classical arms race, I would say. But if we look at quantum and quantum sensing, and if the result of quantum sensing or quantum radars would be that we could see submarines at a depth of 500 meters, then I would say that that's quite disruptive for example, a country like Australia that's now ordering submarines that will only be there in 20 years. Which technology will be first? And what are strategic implications? So we need to, I don't know all the answers, but we need to be very connected to the potential disruptions that might arise.
And as they say, sometimes it's just about asking those right questions, not necessarily having all the answers. And thank you for that segue, because my next question was about Australia and partners more broadly. So scrolling through your Twitter feed, I saw that you had some discussions with your Australian counterpart. So the ambassador for cyber affairs and critical technology of Australia, Tobias Feakin, visited NATO HQ just recently. So what is the role of partners, some of these partners across the globe or partners in general, especially when it comes to some of these technologies that are critical, where sovereignty really does matter, where maybe sometimes the reflex would be to not necessarily overshare. How do you overcome this? And do you see potential actually for expanding partnerships?
Yeah, I think that the underlying questions, and we touch upon it in the ethics piece, is that critical in these new technologies is the mindset that you bring to the table in the use of these technologies. So our democratic values that are really ingrained in our society, in our systems, I would hope that they will prevail in the use of these technologies in the future. And that means that as democratic countries and like-minded countries, we need to work together, stick together to make sure that we have a critical mass to ensure the worldwide standard is actually our standard and not a standard that comes from a more totalitarian or autocratic perspective. Their cooperation with countries like Australia that are technologically advanced and very much on the same page when it comes down to threat perspective, when it comes down to norms and ethics, I think is crucial. So yes, I had a very good conversation with my Australian counterpart, and we did discuss how practically we could collaborate on these issues. So, for example, the AI principles of responsible use, I would be very happy if other democratic partners would sign up to these principles, because what we're doing is we're sending a signal to three audiences. One to our public, that we can be trusted. We are your defense. We want to use these technologies in line with the broader ethics of our societies. The second audience is our adversaries. We're stating, well, this is what we find acceptable. And thereby you can understand what we don't find acceptable. And that's the start of a conversation on that. And third, it's to the private sector that is actually designing these systems. So we're hoping to send a signal, and the more countries sign up, the better, that if you're working on the development and use of AI, then this is what you should take into account as you're doing that. So we're hoping to shape also these commercial developments that are taking place in any case, whether or not we're there or not. So yes, the more the merrier. And if at some point we could extend the Diana network to partners, then I will be very much in favor of that.
Excellent. And now for the final kind of round of questions that marry some of the questions we've had in the Q&A box, and I myself was interested in moving towards the new strategic concept, the Madrid summit next year. EDTs are certainly going to be a big part of it, but so will climate change. NATO again has made some steps towards that front. So a kind of broader question on how does NATO include climate change into its thinking of innovation and kind of advancements in defense and security priorities? Is there talk actually of kind of interaction between these two areas, or are they at the moment siloed? And if they're not, could you offer us some examples what's being done in that regard?
So the good thing is that my division also deals with the climate change portfolio, as well as cyber, as well as counterterrorism, as well as hybrid warfare, as well as energy security. So it's a rather broad portfolio. But the common denominator, I would say, is that a lot of it focuses on the non-traditional threats and threats that come below the threshold of what we call Article 5. So the threshold of an armed attack on one of our allies. So it's a permanently contested environment, which is not war, which is not peace, and where we need to find an answer as an alliance. So certainly that notion will find its place in the new strategic concept. And climate change is one of the greatest threat multipliers that we know in our time. And therefore, it's only logical that we turned into the avenue of what does this mean for our security. And the strategy that we have is threefold there. It focuses on awareness, and awareness means we need to know what the implications, second and third order effects of climate change will be on our own nations, and thereby our security, our critical infrastructure, our military footprint, but also on the environment around us. If we have potential water conflicts skirting the NATO territory, thereby creating a conflict in our surroundings, then that means something for what we need to prepare for in the future. So that's the awareness part. The second part is the adaptation part. Our soldiers are going to have to work in hotter environments. Our helicopters will be less capable in those environments. We will have extreme weather events. We will have to work in colder temperatures. We will have more disaster relief operations. We already have military bases that are flooding 2 or 3 times a year. So there's all kinds of already happening effects that we need to relate to, that we need to adapt our military to in order to be ready. And the last part, and that's always the one, the most controversial one, is mitigation. So yes, the military emits greenhouse gas emissions, and there's your link with innovation as well. So those that are cynical or skeptical, they always say, well, that means that we can only fly our fighter jets between 10 and 2, and then we have to stop the war because we're at our tax of emissions. Or they're joking about tanks on solar panels. To those cynics and skepticals, I always say, well, if you know that the energy transition is going to take place in the next 50 years, in any case, so the whole of society is moving away from fossil fuel in the next 50 years, then do you really think that the military will be the only sector still running on fossil fuels? Because that means that you will now have to start learning how to become an oil company, how to build wells, where are you going to build your refineries, how are you going to have your logistical infrastructure for fossil fuels if no longer the civil world is providing that. And then you see a realization that the military will not be excluded from this transition. And then you have a choice. You can either be at the forefront of innovation in this field, looking at more energy efficient technologies, the use of biofuels, the use of electricity in places where we use fossil fuel. And I think that that's a place that we need to be. So we're slowly working in that direction, and innovation and green technologies are really going to make a difference and save lives, by the way. I mean, if you don't have to have logistical fuel convoys in hostile territory anymore, but you have self-reliant, self-sufficient camps, then that's a huge win from an operational point of view.
That's excellent, and maybe a kind of a nice place to wrap up. I did have a kind of broader final question. If you have in 1 minute, what is one thing that makes you most hopeful in this in this space, and what is one thing that makes you most worried in terms of general technological advancement and its implications for security?
So hopeful. Diana has been agreed on at the highest political level. We have 20 nations that have said, yes, we will invest €1 billion into this deep tech dual-use innovation. So very hopeful that we have the political awareness that this is something we need to do. We need to venture into this area. Worrying, we still, as a Western world, have the technological edge. But if we look at the investments of, for example, the Chinese PLA, which invests $1.6 billion in AI, and that's only the People's Liberation Army, and 60% of that goes to what we would call startups, then we have a lot of catching up to do in order to ensure that we tap into the technological superiority that is in our nations, but not necessarily in our defenses.
Excellent place to stop then, Mr. Van der Wiel. Van Wiel, sorry, I've inserted one more article. I think it's the EU link probably there. But thank you so much for being with us today. I hope that all of you on the call have benefited. I've certainly learned a lot from the past hour, and I do hope that we continue this conversation. And as you said, some of the political commitment is already there, but I hope we'll get to discuss more what the kind of practical and kind of real life developments are over the coming months and years. So thank you again, and thank you to all of you who have been friends of the US Study Center and zooming into these webinars. So just a quick look ahead. Next week could veritably be called a book week. So on Tuesday, 14th of December, there will be a conversation with Ambassador Martin Indyk on his recent book, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy, that will be moderated by Bruce Wolpe and Victoria Cooper. And then on 16th of December, Thursday, there will be a conversation with the New Yorker's Evan Osnes and his recent book, Wildland, The Making of America's Fury, with Charles Edel and John Lee. So make sure that you sign up to these events. They are all going to be on Zoom, just as this one. And of course, we look forward to seeing you in some of the future installments of NATO Expert Series. But that's it from me now. Stay well, stay safe. And if we don't talk in this year, I will certainly do more in the new year. Bye.
Bye.